California is not, it's not normal, the level of homelessness we have here. It's not like it's this way in every state. CEQA is broken. It needs to be fixed. The politics of fixing it are very hard. And it's just not reality to think that we're going to fix the entire housing mess only with public housing. We do have an issue, particularly in San Francisco, where I think a lot of times the police don't want to arrest people for misdemeanors.
Hi, I'm Jialu Streeter. I'm the Director of Partnerships at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. Today, I'm speaking with Senator Scott Wiener at his district office in San Francisco. Senator Wiener, thank you for speaking with me today.
Thank you.
So first of all, could you please introduce yourself and how you got into working in housing?
I'm Scott Wiener, and I represent San Francisco and northern San Mateo County in the California State Senate. And before that, I served on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. And I've been focused on housing for a very long time because it's really at the heart of so many of the challenges that we face in San Francisco and throughout California in terms of economic opportunity and homelessness and climate change and poverty. They all really come back to housing and the obscene cost of housing. And it's just very damaging to any community when people can't afford housing.
Right.
It's just very bad, and so that's why I focus on it.
So we know there are a lot of factors that are related to homelessness. Could you maybe share the top 3 reasons why California is facing this homeless crisis right now?
Well, first and foremost, the lack of available and affordable housing. There are a lot of, even though there's a perception that homeless people are overwhelmingly suffering from mental health and drug addiction issues, that's not true. Many homeless people don't have mental health or drug issues. They simply can't afford housing. And a lot of our lowest income residents who used to be able to find some sort of housing they can afford no longer can. And so they are living often in cars or in homeless shelters or couch surfing or otherwise in places where we don't want people to be living. And so if housing were available and affordable in the way that we want it to be, we would have far fewer homeless people. And then but you layer on top of that the challenges we have around mental health and drug addiction, and you have a certain segment of the homeless population where that is a significant factor in why they are homeless. They just weren't able to function in the way that they needed to function to be able to work and afford housing. And then, of course, once they're homeless, mental health and addiction issues tend to get worse because you're in a very unstable kind of situation. So I think those are the primary reasons why we have so many homeless people here in California. And to be clear, California is not, it's not normal, the level of homelessness we have here. It's not like it's this way in every state. California is about 12% of the US population, but we have 25% of the nation's homelessness and 50% of the nation's unsheltered homeless. So this is not normal, and it doesn't have to be this way, and it's because primarily of the extreme cost of housing here.
Thank you for sharing that. So you mentioned housing, and according to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, their data in 2015 shows that California has a housing shortage that's twice as much as in New York. So what are some of the main reasons for this housing shortage?
We are short millions of homes overall, somewhere between 2 and 3.5 million homes, and about half of that is homes affordable to low-income people. And that didn't just happen overnight. It happened because of deliberate policy choices that California made starting in the 1970s, so we're going on 50 years now, to deprioritize housing and to make it incredibly hard or impossible to build enough housing. Back in the 1950s into the 1960s, California was building upwards of 300 or 330,000 new homes per year when we were a state of 15 million people. We're now a state of 40 million people, and we build around 90 to 100,000 homes a year. So we're a much bigger state, and our housing production is down by about almost 75%. And that happened because at that time, starting in the 70s, we passed a slew of state and local laws that made it harder to build housing. At the local level, in the 70s and 80s, cities downzoned and basically banned multi-unit construction in the vast majority of California, allowing only for single-family homes in about 70% of California. That automatically makes housing more expensive because there's less housing that's zoned for, and the housing that you are zoning for is the most expensive kind of housing, single-family homes. In addition, we restricted height limits. We just dramatically cut back on the ability to build more housing. At the state level, we passed the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, in the early 70s, which was always intended to protect the environment when you're building a new highway or building a dam or something that can be really harmful to the environment. It, over time, has been applied aggressively toward stopping new housing, even housing that is very environmentally sustainable. And cities adopted all sorts of long approval processes. And so over time, we kept layering all these new difficulties for building housing, and it's no wonder that we're building so little housing.
Mm-hmm. Is there any prospect of repeal CEQA anytime soon?
I don't think we would ever repeal CEQA, and I don't think we should repeal CEQA. I think we should reform CEQA so that it does not undermine environmentally sustainable, climate-friendly development. CEQA should never be able to stop, building a new bus line that gets people out of their cars. It should not be able to stop infill development of housing. So when you're putting housing near jobs or near public transportation, that's inherently climate friendly. CEQA should not have anything to say about slowing that down or stopping it. So CEQA is broken and needs to be fixed. The politics of fixing it are very hard.
What's your general philosophy towards housing? To what extent can we rely on the private market to solve California's housing problem?
My approach to housing is all of the above. And it's going to take a lot of work by both the private sector and government to make it happen. I think sometimes different kinds of housing gets pitted against each other. It's market rate versus below market rate, or single family versus apartment buildings, or renting versus ownership. And my view is we need all of it. When you are short millions of homes, you can't be choosy about, no, we only want that kind of housing. So we absolutely need a robust public investment in what we call affordable housing or public housing, which we used to build a lot of publicly owned housing, and then it stopped in the 80s. We need to get back to that and have a big, big investment by government in building publicly owned, we now call it social housing. That's critically important as a safety net to make sure everyone has a place to live. But we're never going to solve this problem and this shortage only with government investment. It's just not going to happen. There's not enough public funding to do that. And it's just not reality to think that we're going to fix the entire housing mess only with public housing. It also will not particularly solve our middle class housing problem. Right now, 90% of low-income Californians live in market rate housing. So 90% of low-income Californians live in market rate housing. For middle class, it's probably 99.9%. And so it's going to be very hard to even get enough publicly owned, funded housing just for low-income people. For the middle class, that's where the private sector really comes in.
Right.
So we need both.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So you introduced SB 35 to facilitate the construction of housing and streamline review processes. The bill was signed into effect in 2017. So that's like 5 years ago. Would you have any data now to show whether the approval process the length has shortened since
The
then?
data, we don't have comprehensive data, but we have a lot of data, and all of the data that we have shows that SB 35 has been extremely successful. In San Francisco alone, almost 2,500 units of affordable housing have been streamlined and approved under SB 35. Around the state, we know of a large and growing number of housing projects, both 100% affordable, market rate, mixed income, everything that's being approved under SB 35, and it's accelerating over time. We've learned about a few different cities that have never had an SB 35 project that now have SB 35 projects. So it's accelerating around the state, and it's a very successful law.
So at some point, I think in the beginning, there was some opposition to SB 35 by local affordable housing and tenant groups. So now do you think they have changed their position on the legislation? Now we have some positive results.
I think some have, and there are some groups that oppose SB 35 that are now using it. And so they had concerns about potential for displacement and gentrification. It's turned out that I knew at the time that critique was not going to play out that way, and it has not, in fact, played out that way. So I think there's a lot more support for SB 35 now than there was when it was passed in 2017. And so I'm going to need to do legislation at some point to extend it because it has a sunset provision in it, and I think we'll have more support than we had last time.
That's great. Are there any other proposals in the pipeline that's going to facilitate the supply of housing in this area?
Yeah, there are a lot of. We've passed a number of laws in the last few years.
SB 9.
In addition to SB 35, SB 9 and 10, do some zoning reform. We've strengthened the state's 40-year-old affordable housing density bonus program that gives developers an incentive to put more affordable units in their projects in exchange for being able to build more units overall. We've strengthened our accessory dwelling unit law, ADUs or in-law units, to make it easier for people to put one or two of these in-law units in their homes. We've strengthened our accountability laws to make sure that cities are actually following state law and allowing housing to be built. So we've also strengthened our the housing planning and goal setting that cities have to do.
I feel like a lot of the housing issue in the Bay Area is caused by we cannot commute very fast in the morning and in the afternoon, right? So if we can all live far away, if the highway is wider and bigger, then we could move further away, and then the housing problem probably will be alleviated. Is there any prospect of improving the freeway infrastructure?
Well, I mean, there's been a lot of data and studies on what happens when you widen freeways, and it doesn't reduce commute times because it triggers something called induced demand, where then you have more people piling onto the roads. And so the studies they've done where they've done highway widening shows that at the very beginning, it's easier for people and faster travel times. But then over time, it goes right back to where it was before.
A new equilibrium.
Yeah, so highway widening is extremely expensive, and it actually doesn't end up creating many benefits. And so my view is we want to maintain the highways so they're in good condition, but we should be focusing our investment on public transportation to try to make public transit more accessible to more people, because there are a lot of people who can't realistically use transit. They have to drive. And if we can give more people options, that will help us with commute times.
So it's one thing for the state to pass laws to create more housing and require cities to expedite approval processes or to upzone. but enforcing the law can sometimes be challenging. So can you maybe share some examples of housing regulations that are not really used or not really enforced?
Well, so between the late 1960s and the early 1980s, California passed a series of housing laws, including the Housing Accountability Act, the state density bonus, the housing element law, the accessory dwelling unit law, and a few others. These are all good, important laws, but they had no teeth in them. And so the cities would either ignore them or they would just go through an empty, meaningless process to comply in a way that didn't do anything. And so they were dead letters. And one of the things that we've done in the last 5, 6 years has been to put teeth into these long-standing laws. So now all of those laws are much stronger. Cities can't ignore them anymore. And we've given a lot of enforcement power to the Attorney General and to the Housing and Community Development Department, HCD, our housing agency. They have more tools to crack down on cities that are violating the law, either to work with those cities to help them comply, or when you have bad actors that are just don't want to comply, to force them to comply through penalties, through litigation, etc. So we've really put a lot more teeth and accountability into our housing laws.
That's good to hear. Is it unique to California to have this struggle between the state and the local government, or do other states face the same challenge?
On housing, I think it's not unique. There are other states that have had these struggles, but I think California is probably ahead in terms of it's conflict, but it's healthy conflict, because the way we've done housing in the past, letting cities do whatever they want, doesn't work, and it's given us this disaster that we have, where people are living in cars and have 2-hour commutes or have to move out of state entirely. And so having stronger state housing laws is a critical part of solving our housing crisis. And that is awkward because people and cities are used to doing it the old way. And we're saying, no, we need to do it this different way. And so there's conflict, but in the end, it'll settle out over time and we'll just have a new way of approaching the issue.
Thank you for sharing that. Some people accuse NIMBY, not in my backyard movement, of being selfish or short-sighted. But sometimes from the homeowner's perspective, they perhaps have taken out a big mortgage, or maybe they spent their lifetime savings on this house. So it makes sense for them to not want their home value to decline due to new developments that increase density. So is there any viable solution? I heard some people say maybe the new developers could compensate existing homeowners. So have you heard of those kind of proposals?
I've not heard of that kind of proposal. I think that would be a very bad idea, because that would mean that the new housing would have to be much more expensive. The more costs that you put on development, the more expensive that new housing is. So that, I think, would, in my view, would not be a good idea. Most people, including most homeowners, support new housing, and most homeowners, according to polling, are okay with multi-unit housing in their neighborhoods. Single-family homes are very expensive, very valuable in California, and they hold their value well, and they're going to continue to hold their value well. And putting a multi-unit building into a single-family neighborhood does not reduce the value of those single-family homes. In fact, if we are building fewer single-family homes because we're building more multi-unit, those single-family homes will become even more valuable. So I'm a homeowner. I understand the desire. We all want our homes to hold their value, and we make a lot of plans based on the value of our homes, and we can query whether that's the best system of wealth accumulation, but that's the system we have, and so I'm very respectful of that. Allowing multi-unit construction does not undermine the value of people's homes. If anything, it can make it more valuable.
But just purely from like a supply and demand point of view, like if you have more multi-family units, and then you can house a lot more people suddenly in this neighborhood, wouldn't that drive down the price?
But single-family homes are different than multi-unit, let's say a condo. And yes, in terms of the condo market, if you build a lot more condos, it could, it could reduce the appreciation. Although we haven't seen that really in San Francisco. We've built a lot of condos over time, and condos are still really valuable here. But single-family homes are, I think, it's not exactly the same market. And if you are not seeing an increase in the number of single-family homes, a lot of people want to live in single-family homes, which is great. I'm not against single-family homes. I just want people to have a choice and flexibility. And there are a lot of people who can't afford a single-family home, but they could afford a condo. Like when I bought a condo. I could never have afforded a single-family home. And so it just gives people options. And so I think overall, in terms of the single-family home market, it's going to be fine. And putting condos in is not going to reduce the value of single-family homes.
Thank you. Safety. So you supported decarceration. We know that when formerly incarcerated individuals don't receive adequate support for training, job training, and the community re-engagement, they may end up on the street. We also know from data that formerly incarcerated people are 10 times more likely to be homeless than the general public. Are there any policies or programs that are in place right now to help release the prisoners to get back on their feet?
Yeah. Yes, there are programs to help people re-enter society, and you're absolutely right. We need to provide people with support in terms of housing, in terms of job training, which hopefully happened while they were incarcerated too, healthcare, and so forth. If you can really provide strong support for people in the period after they're released, you can get them on their feet and they can have a successful life. If you just dump people out of prison, with a bus ticket and that's it, they're going to struggle, and they're much more likely to reoffend and end up in prison again. And so we do have programs. It's not enough. We need to do more. And there is a push this year in the legislature specifically around housing for people who are leaving prison. That's so critically important.
California is one of the 3 states in the nation that have abolished cash bail. The public sentiment on the police has shifted from defund the police in 2020 to refund the police now. And could you talk a little bit about the implications of 2 things, no cash bail plus Proposition 47, so the implications of those 2 things on crime, especially as we see a lot of the smash and grab robberies during the holiday shopping season last year?
Yeah, so I'm a supporter of ending cash bail. When someone has been arrested for a crime and is awaiting trial, in terms of determining who should be held in jail and who should be released pending trial, it shouldn't have to do with whether you have money. It should have to do with whether you're dangerous, whether you're a flight risk. And so if someone is dangerous and a flight risk, I don't care if they can afford a huge bail, they shouldn't be released. If someone is not dangerous, is not a flight risk, then they shouldn't be held simply because they don't have money to pay bail. It's a very irrational system, literally saying it doesn't matter whether you're dangerous or a flight risk, all that matters is whether you can write a check. So it's a bad system, and it's very inequitable, and it doesn't really help public safety. There have been some situations where crimes have been committed when someone is out on bail, and so so obviously the bail system did not work there. And the question is not whether they should be paying bail; it's whether they should have been released at all. And so California has moved away from cash bail, and I'm glad that we did that. And I think we if the system is implemented well, which of course any new system has to be implemented well, we'll be safer as a result. In terms of Prop 47, I think there's been a narrative that Prop 47 is to blame for the smash and grabs. That is completely false. What Prop 47 did is it didn't decriminalize anything. It didn't legalize anything. It said that the threshold for what is considered misdemeanor shoplifting versus felony shoplifting was raised from, I believe it was $450 to, I think, $950. So it's now $950. Fun fact, in the state of Texas, Law and Order Texas, the threshold is $1,300. It's higher than California, and that's true in a number of states. So California, we had this number that was set many years ago, and if you take inflation into account, it was, it should have been raising over time. So the voters increased it. It was totally appropriate. It didn't. If it's under 950, it's still a crime. It's a misdemeanor, and you can go to county jail for a year for a misdemeanor. Mm-hmm. So if you steal under $950 worth of items, you can be arrested, you can be prosecuted, you can be convicted, and you can spend up to a year in county jail. And so the idea that Prop 47 reduced accountability or took away is just wrong. And we do have an issue, particularly in San Francisco, where I think a lot of times the police don't want to arrest people for misdemeanors. That's not a Prop 47 issue. That's an issue that we have here in San Francisco that we need to work through. In addition, these smash and grabs that we're seeing, so many of them, there are a lot of them that are well in excess of $950. These people, and if they're breaking in and breaking the windows, those are other crimes that are probably felonies. Breaking into a car is a felony. So I think there's been a narrative put out there by some who have sometimes ulterior motives that California is letting people off the hook. Well, the laws are not letting people off the hook. Prop 47 isn't letting people off the hook. We need to make sure that the police are arresting people who are committing these crimes so we can have accountability.
So why aren't the police arresting those people?
That's a question for the police. And I think, in San Francisco, we are short-staffed with police. We do not have enough police officers, and that is a real challenge. And so when you don't have enough officers, you prioritize certain crimes over other crimes. And if we had enough officers, they'd be able to address all of those crimes, because these store owners who are having people come in and steal things, it's harmful to those store owners, right? A lot of these, even for the bigger businesses, if they have huge shoplifting problems, it raises prices for everyone. But for these small business owners, it's very, very harmful to have people come in and steal regularly from your store. You're just trying to make ends meet, and it's making life a lot harder for you. So we do need to have accountability for those crimes, and the laws in the books now do allow for accountability.
So you mentioned the shortage of police officers. Is there any prospect of refund the police or strengthening the police force?
Well, I don't think there was a lot of defunding the police happening in California. There were a few here and there. In San Francisco, it never really happened. I will tell you that it's harder to recruit people into policing now. I regularly attend our police academy graduations, before the pandemic, those graduations, the class would have 50 cadets and maybe 40 would graduate. I went to one last night, the first live one since the pandemic, and there were 13 cadets who graduated. So there are fewer people who are going into policing now because of, policing is just not viewed in the same way that it was before. More people want to be firefighters or paramedics or other kinds of first responders. And so I hope we can get to the point where more people are interested in going into policing, understanding that policing has changed,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that the policing is different now than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago in terms of expectations and how you interact with the community and trying to avoid significant use of force unless it's absolutely necessary. And I think we will achieve that, but we're going through a difficult transition time now.
So you introduced the bill SB 855, signed into effect in September 2020. So this law requires insurance companies, private insurance companies, to cover more mental health and addiction treatments. Your bill addresses the parity issue, right? But on the other hand, we do still see a huge gap between supply and demand in psychiatric treatment. Psychiatric beds, for example, the supply to demand ratio is 1 to 3 in California. So are there any viable solutions to address the shortage in both inpatient and outpatient treatment?
Yeah, and I actually have legislation this year, first of all, to start shoring up and expanding our mental health workforce. We have a workforce shortage, which is going to get very bad in the next 5 to 10 years if we don't take strong action. So we have legislation, Senate bill, I believe it's 964, that will help create more financial incentives for people to go into mental health related fields, whether it's social work or other kinds of mental health workforce needs. So that's one thing that we have to do. We also, by requiring mental health parity, I think we will also see more. That creates a strong incentive for health plans to provide better funding and reimbursement rates, so that we have more people entering the mental health workforce and accepting insurance, because there are a lot of therapists that won't accept insurance, for example, because the reimbursement rates are so low. We also, in terms of psych beds, that's two things. First, we have to make sure the hospitals are actually not closing down their psych units. We have, in San Francisco, I believe there are only 2 hospitals that really have psych units, and there used to be more. So we need to make sure the hospitals are doing their fair share to have those beds. We also need public investment. And so in San Francisco, the mayor has prioritized funding for more mental health beds. And that is gradually happening over time. They're very expensive, but they're really important. So I think those are a few things that we need to be doing.
So you mentioned that we need more public investment in mental health treatment. But we had the Mental Health Services Act that was passed in 2004, which levies 1% tax on millionaires, basically. So why couldn't we use that tax revenue to fund the mental health?
That is already funding quite a few mental health services. It generates about $2.5 billion a year, which is great, but it's not enough for all of our needs. We do have an issue where that money generally runs through the counties. Some counties are spending it really well. Some counties are not spending it well. Some counties barely spend it at all, and they just let it accumulate in an account. So there's been a lot of work over the last few years to try to have better guardrails for that money, to make sure that counties are spending it and that they're spending it in the right way.
Why are they not spending it?
Well, LA County for years was barely spending it, and it had accumulated a huge amount of money in reserve. I think they're spending it now, but I think every county takes a different approach.
Right. My last question is, we know that a lot of unsheltered homeless don't have private insurance. So in that case, the SB 855 will not be able to help them.
Well, we need to get more and more homeless people onto Medi-Cal. The reason we didn't include Medi-Cal in SB 855 is because Medi-Cal actually does a better job than the private insurance market in terms of covering mental health. I'm the eternal optimist. I think we're, these issues, mental health, homelessness, housing, are very hard. It's easy to believe that they're intractable, but they're not intractable. They just require focus and investment and a willingness to make reforms, and we're doing that. And it never happens fast enough. And sometimes solutions play out over time, over years, or a lot of years. But I think we are moving in the right direction. I think we've become so polarized in this country. But for a lot of these issues, like mental health, we have bipartisan support in the legislature for the work we do around mental health. So I think, and on housing too, we always get bipartisan support. So these issues don't have to be polarized.
Thank you. Well,
Yeah.
Senator Wiener, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you.